The millionaire's deaf daughter never heard, until a poor girl did the impossible. Grace Sterling had not made a single sound for exactly 3 years and 2 months. Her condition baffled the entire team of private doctors hired by her father, businessman Arthur Sterling, owner of the largest construction company in upstate New York. No treatment, no matter how expensive, had managed to restore the girl's hearing lost after that fateful car accident. It was during another silent afternoon in the mansion's garden that an unknown girl appeared out of nowhere. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, wore a simple, already faded red dress and had a determination in her eyes that contrasted with her apparent fragility. Without hesitation, she approached Grace directly and did something no one else had managed to do in all these years. She delicately touched the rich girl's face and murmured words that made the millionaire's daughter's eyes fill with tears for the first time since the accident. "You can hear me in here," said the mysterious girl, placing her hand over Grace's chest. "I know because I've been in your place too." Martha, the housekeeper who cared for Grace, ran toward the two girls, trying to shoo the intruder away. "Girl, you can't be here. How did you get onto the property? Where are your parents?" But Grace, for the first time in years, reacted intensely to a situation. She firmly grabbed the arm of the girl in the red dress and shook her head vigorously, indicating she didn't want her to leave. Her eyes, normally empty and distant, shone with a life they hadn't shown in a long time. Arthur Sterling watched everything from the second-floor balcony of his imposing residence. At 42, he had amassed an impressive fortune through his construction company, but all his money had not been enough to cure his only daughter. Seeing Grace's unprecedented reaction, he rushed down the marble stairs and headed to the garden. "Who are you?" he asked the girl in red, trying to maintain an authoritative tone but betrayed by the curiosity in his voice. "My name is Faith, sir. Faith Miller," replied the girl, raising her chin with an impressive dignity for someone so small. "And I know how to help your daughter hear again." Arthur almost laughed at the statement. Dozens of specialist doctors, renowned therapists, and state-of-the-art equipment had failed. How could a ragged little girl make a difference? "That's impossible. My daughter has undergone every possible test. Her deafness is permanent." Faith looked directly into the businessman's eyes, with a seriousness disconcerting for her age. "Have you ever tried to find out why she stopped hearing exactly on the day her mother left home?" The question hit Arthur like a punch to the stomach. That information wasn't in the medical records, hadn't been shared with anyone outside the closest family. How did that girl know about the troubled separation that had preceded the accident? Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us, who are just starting out. Now continuing. "How do you know that?" Arthur asked, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Because I also lost my hearing when my parents left," Faith explained with disturbing calm. "But my grandmother Dorothy taught me that sometimes we stop hearing not because we can't, but because we don't want to hear things that hurt too much anymore." Grace had sat down on the grass next to Faith, watching the girl's lips intently as she spoke. For the first time since the accident, she showed genuine interest in what someone was saying. Arthur Sterling knelt beside the two girls, studying his daughter with an attention he hadn't dedicated to her in a long time. Grace Sterling wore a light green dress, a color his wife Elizabeth always said brought out her brown eyes. The businessman swallowed dryly as he realized how emotionally distant he had become from his daughter in recent years, obsessively focusing on finding medical cures instead of trying to understand what had really happened to her. "Was your grandmother a doctor?" asked Arthur, still skeptical. "She was a spiritual healer here in the neighborhood," Faith Miller answered simply. "She took care of many children who went through difficult times. She taught me that sometimes the heart gets so hurt that the head decides to protect us by stopping some parts from working." The girl's simple language held a wisdom that months of doctor's appointments hadn't provided. Arthur remembered how Grace had witnessed the increasingly intense arguments between him and Elizabeth in the months leading up to the separation. The girl used to hide behind the living room curtains, watching her parents scream at each other about money, about time, about completely different priorities in life. "Where do you live, Faith?" asked Arthur, realizing he needed to know more about this intriguing girl. "In the East Side, on the other side of town. I live with Mrs. Hattie. She takes care of me now. The East Side was known in the region as one of the most underprivileged neighborhoods. Arthur knew it was almost an hour away from his residence in the Hamptons. How had an 8-year-old girl managed to get there alone? How did you get here? I came by bus. I saved recycling money from cans I collected for 2 weeks, Faith explained, without showing any shame. I had a dream with Grandma Dorothy. She told me there was a girl who needed my help and she showed me this house. Arthur didn't believe in prophetic dreams, but there was something in Faith's absolute sincerity that stopped him from simply dismissing her. Besides, Grace's reaction was undeniable. The girl hadn't shown this much interest in anything since before the accident. "What exactly would you do to help my daughter?" he asked, deciding to at least hear the proposal. Faith turned to Grace and began making gentle movements with her hands near the girl's face. They weren't ASL signs, which Arthur would recognize, but something completely different. Grace followed every movement with her eyes, and gradually her face relaxed in a way her father hadn't seen in years. "First, she needs to remember it's safe to listen again," Faith explained as she continued the movements. "Then we work slowly to open the little doors she closed in her head." "This makes no medical sense," Arthur murmured, but his voice no longer carried the initial distrust. "Medicine isn't just medicine and machines, sir," Faith replied with impressive maturity. "Sometimes it's just love and patience." At that moment, Grace did something that paralyzed both her father and the housekeeper, Martha. She opened her mouth and let out a low sound, almost imperceptible, but clearly intentional. It was the first time she had tried to vocalize anything since the accident. "My God," whispered Martha, bringing her hands to her chest. She tried to speak. Arthur felt his eyes fill with tears. For 3 years he had convinced himself his daughter was forever lost in her silent world. Seeing that small demonstration of life was like witnessing a miracle. "Can you come back tomorrow?" he asked Faith, trying to keep his tone controlled, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "Yes, sir. But I can't come every day. Only when I manage to save money for the fair." Arthur took his wallet from his pocket and offered some dollars to the girl, but Faith immediately stepped back. "I can't accept your money. Grandma Dorothy always said helping people isn't a service you charge for." The refusal left Arthur even more intrigued. In his corporate world, everything had a price. Everything was a negotiation. Finding someone who offered help without expecting anything in return was a completely new experience for him. "Then how can I repay your help?" Faith thought for a few seconds, watching Grace, who was absent-mindedly playing with blades of grass. "You can promise that you'll be patient with her, and that you'll try to understand what she's feeling, not just what she can't do." The remark hit Arthur squarely. For the last 3 years, he had focused exclusively on Grace's limitations, on the treatment she needed, on the therapies that didn't work. When was the last time he had simply tried to understand what his daughter was feeling? Faith stood up, smoothing her wrinkled red dress. "I need to get back before it gets dark. Mrs. Hattie gets worried when I'm late." "Wait," Arthur said quickly. "How will I know when you can come back?" "I'll try to come next Wednesday. If I can't make it Wednesday, then Saturday." "What if I send someone to pick you up? My driver could—" Faith shook her head. "Mrs. Hattie doesn't let me ride in cars with strangers, but thank you anyway." Arthur watched the girl walk away toward the mansion gate, her steps determined. Grace followed her with her eyes until Faith disappeared from view, and only then turned her attention back to her father. For a few minutes, father and daughter sat side by side in the garden, each lost in their own thoughts. The sunset tinted the sky with orange hues, creating an almost magical atmosphere around the property. For the first time in a long while, Arthur wasn't thinking about work appointments or urgent phone calls. His attention was completely focused on his daughter. "You liked her, didn't you?" Arthur asked Grace, knowing he wouldn't receive a verbal answer, but hoping for some sign. Grace nodded positively, a clear and decided movement. Then she pointed to the gate where Faith had left and made a gesture that Arthur interpreted as, "Come back." "She said she'll come back on Wednesday," Arthur explained, and was surprised to see Grace count on her fingers, calculating how many days were left. That night, during the silent dinner that had become routine in the house, Arthur watched his daughter differently. Grace ate methodically, paying attention to every movement around her. He realized she wasn't simply a child lost in her own world. She was attentive, observing, processing information. The deafness hadn't diminished her intelligence or capacity for understanding. After Grace went to her room, Arthur stayed in the living room going over the day's events. He picked up the phone and called Dr. Thomas Barrett, the neurologist who had been following his daughter's case for 2 years. "Doctor, I need to talk to you about something that happened today with Grace." "Of course, Arthur. Has there been any change in her condition?" "A girl showed up at the house today, said she could help Grace, and..." Grace reacted very positively. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What kind of reaction? She tried to make sounds and showed real interest in interacting with the girl. "Arthur, you know I don't believe in miracles or charlatanism. Grace's deafness has neurological causes confirmed by the tests." "I know, Doctor, but what if there are also psychological factors that haven't been considered?" "We've discussed this. Emotional trauma can aggravate neurological conditions, but it doesn't cause permanent deafness by itself." Arthur felt a familiar frustration growing in his chest. For 3 years he had religiously followed all medical advice, and the result was always the same: no significant progress. "Doctor, with all due respect, I'd like to explore other possibilities." "Beware of false hope, Arthur. We've seen many families deceived by people promising miracle cures." After ending the call, Arthur went upstairs to check on Grace. The girl was sleeping peacefully in her bed, with a serene expression he hadn't seen in a long time. In recent years, even in sleep she seemed tense, as if carrying an invisible weight. He sat in the armchair beside the bed and watched his daughter for a few minutes. Grace had her mother's brown hair and the tendency to sleep on her side, hugging a pillow. Characteristics Arthur had stopped noticing amidst all the medical worries and professional responsibilities. The next morning during breakfast, Grace did something unexpected. She took a piece of paper and drew a figure of a girl in a red dress. It was a simple drawing, but it clearly represented Faith. Then she drew a second figure next to the first, representing herself. Martha, who was serving coffee, stopped to look at the drawing. "She's never drawn people before," the housekeeper commented. "She only made meaningless scribbles." Arthur examined the paper carefully. The drawing showed the 2 girls holding hands, smiling. It was the first time Grace had expressed any kind of emotion through art. "Are you thinking about Faith?" Arthur asked his daughter. Grace nodded yes and pointed to the calendar on the kitchen wall, indicating she knew there were still days left before the girls' return. In the following days, Arthur found himself watching Grace more closely. The girl had well-established routines. She always woke at the same time, organized her toys in a specific way, and spent long periods watching the garden from her bedroom window. She wasn't a lost or confused child. She was dealing with her condition in an organized and intelligent way. On Tuesday, the day before Faith had promised to return, Grace showed clear signs of anxiety. She constantly checked the gate and positioned herself near the window overlooking the property's entrance. It was evident she had perfectly understood the girl's promise and was counting the days. Arthur decided not to go to the office on Wednesday, a decision that surprised his secretary, as he never missed work without a serious medical reason. He wanted to be present when Faith arrived, to personally observe the interaction between the 2 girls. Around 2 in the afternoon, Arthur was reviewing some documents in the living room when Martha called him from the porch. "Mr. Arthur, the girl is here." He got up quickly and went to the window. Faith was walking through the garden toward the house, wearing the same red dress, now visibly cleaner. Grace had already run to meet her, and the 2 greeted each other like old friends reuniting. Arthur went out into the garden and noticed Faith was carrying a small cloth bag. "I brought some things that might help," explained Faith, opening the bag to show its contents. Inside were stones of different sizes and textures, small bells and some objects Arthur couldn't immediately identify. "Grandma Dorothy used to say we can feel sounds in other ways, not just with our ears," Faith explained. "These stones vibrate when you tap them, and the little bells make different little noises." Faith took one of the stones and gently tapped it against another. Arthur couldn't hear anything significant, but Grace immediately placed her hand on the stone and smiled. She was feeling the vibrations. "Can she perceive it?" asked Arthur, fascinated. "Yes, you can. Grandma taught me that when we lose one sense, the others grow stronger. Grace can feel many things that other people can't." Faith spent the next hour working with Grace, using the objects from the bag. She created patterns of vibration, textures, and movements that the girl followed with evident interest. At several points, Grace tried to reproduce the sounds she was feeling through the vibrations, emitting small vocal noises. Arthur watched, impressed by Faith's patience and intuition. The 8-year-old girl demonstrated an understanding of trauma and healing that many adults did not possess. "How did you learn to do this?" asked Arthur during a pause. "Grandma taught me when I went deaf too," Faith replied casually. "After my parents left, I couldn't hear anything anymore. Grandma said my heart was protecting my head from hearing sad things." "And how did you start hearing again?" "When I understood it was safe to hear again. When Grandma showed me that not all sounds are scary. Some sounds are gentle." Arthur knelt beside the two girls. "Faith, can I ask you a personal question? What happened to your parents?" The girl stopped playing with the stones and looked directly at Arthur. "They had to go away. Daddy lost his job and they thought it would be better for me to stay with Grandma until they could get back on their feet. But they never managed to come back." "And now you live with Mrs. Hattie?" "Yes. Grandma Dorothy went to heaven last year, so Mrs. Hattie adopted me. She's very good to me." The simplicity with which Faith handled such significant losses was both impressive and moving. Arthur realized that this girl had faced challenges that many adults could not bear, and yet she maintained an extraordinary capacity to help others. During the following weeks, Faith began visiting the mansion regularly on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Grace progressively began to emit more vocal sounds and showed signs that she was processing auditory information, even if in a limited way. Dr. Thomas Barrett, initially resistant to the unorthodox sessions, agreed to observe one at Arthur's request. After spending 2 hours watching Faith's work, the neurologist admitted he was intrigued by the results. "I cannot scientifically explain what I'm seeing," he said to Arthur after the session, "but there is a clear improvement in Grace's responsiveness. Perhaps we should consider psychological aspects that haven't been properly explored." "Are you saying there's a real chance of recovery?" "I'm saying we should keep an open mind to different approaches. What this girl is doing is clearly working on some level." Arthur felt more hopeful than at any moment in the last 3 years. For the first time, a medical professional had admitted that perhaps there were paths that hadn't been explored. During one of the sessions, Faith made an observation that would completely change Arthur's perspective on his daughter's case. "Mr. Arthur, can I ask something about the day of the accident?" Arthur felt his muscles tense. Talking about that day was still extremely painful for him. "What do you want to know?" "Was Grace in the car when it happened?" "No. The accident was with my ex-wife. Grace was at home with me." Faith stopped playing with the stones and stared at Arthur. "So she went deaf the same day? But she wasn't in the accident?" "Exactly. The doctors said it was a coincidence, that the condition was probably already developing and the emotional shock accelerated the process." "Mr. Arthur," Faith said slowly, as if organizing her thoughts, "what if it wasn't a coincidence? What if she chose to stop listening at the exact moment she learned her mother was gone forever?" The question struck Arthur like a bolt of lightning. For 3 years he had accepted the medical explanation without deeply questioning the temporal connection between the events. What if Faith was right? What if Grace's deafness was a conscious or unconscious emotional response to the loss of her mother? "Are you suggesting her deafness is psychological?" "I'm suggesting that maybe she closed her ears when her heart broke," Faith replied, with a wisdom that completely contradicted her age. "And maybe we need to heal the heart before we can open the ears." That night, Arthur spent hours going over the events surrounding the accident. Elizabeth had left the house after a particularly intense argument about the family's future. She wanted him to slow down his work pace, to spend more time at home to prioritize the family over the company. He had argued that he was working hard precisely to secure the family's future. The argument had happened in the living room, but Grace was in her bedroom, technically out of earshot. Or at least that's what Arthur and Elizabeth had assumed at the time. What if the girl had heard everything? What if she had understood that her mother was leaving because of her father's misplaced priorities? Arthur remembered how Grace had reacted in the hours immediately after they received the news of the accident. She hadn't cried or shown the despair one would expect. Instead, she became completely silent, as if she had disconnected from the world around her. In the next session with Faith, Arthur decided to address his suspicions directly. "Faith, how can I know if Grace really chose to stop listening?" "By talking to her about things that hurt," Faith answered simply. "Sometimes we need to talk about the pain for it to stop hurting. But how can I talk to her if she doesn't hear?" Faith smiled and pointed to her heart. "She hears in here, Mr. Sterling. The problem is, maybe she's afraid to show she's listening." "Why would she be afraid?" "Because if she shows she can hear, maybe she'll have to hear things she doesn't want to hear, like people fighting, or people saying her mommy isn't ever coming back." Faith's explanation made sense in a disturbing way. Arthur realized he had never talked directly with Grace about the loss of her mother, about his own failings as a father, or about how she felt about everything that had happened. He had assumed that because she was deaf, those conversations would be impossible. "How can I talk to her about these things?" "The same way you're talking to me now, speaking from the heart, not just with your mouth." Faith turned to Grace, who was playing with the vibrating stones, and gestured for her to come closer. "Grace, your father wants to talk to you about important things. Will you listen?" Grace looked between Faith and her father, and Arthur saw in her eyes a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She nodded yes, but stayed close to Faith, as if the girl were her source of safety. Arthur knelt in front of his daughter, taking her small hands in his. "Grace, I know you can understand me, even if you don't show it. I want to talk about your mother, and about how I failed both of you." Grace's eyes fixed intently on her father's lips, and Arthur realized she was doing much more advanced lip-reading than anyone had noticed. "Mommy left because I wasn't being a good husband or a good father. I was more worried about work than about you, and when she had the accident, I felt guilty, but I also didn't know how to talk to you about it." Tears began to well up in Grace's eyes, and she squeezed her father's hands more tightly. "I know you heard our last fight. I know you know that Mom left because she was upset with me. And I know you stopped listening so you don't have to hear more sad things." Grace began to sob silently, and Arthur pulled her into a hug they hadn't shared in years. "But I've changed, my daughter. I've learned that nothing is more important than you. And I promise you will never have to stop listening to protect yourself from me again." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. It was at that moment that the unthinkable happened. Grace lifted her head from her father's chest, looked directly into his eyes, and whispered the first word she had spoken in 3 years. "Daddy." The word was soft, almost imperceptible, but clear enough for Arthur to hear. Faith smiled through her own tears and placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. "There. She's decided it's safe to listen again." Arthur hugged his daughter tighter, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he had real hope that they could rebuild the father-daughter relationship that had been lost in the emotional storm preceding the accident. In the following days, Grace began to show progressive signs of improvement in her hearing. She reacted to specific sounds, especially to her father's voice when he spoke in a caring tone. Dr. Thomas Barrett was perplexed by the speed of the recovery, admitting there were elements in the case that medical science did not yet fully understand. "It's as if an internal barrier has been removed," the doctor explained to Arthur. "The neurological exams always indicated her auditory structure was intact. Perhaps there really was a psychological component, preventing normal function." Arthur dedicated himself entirely to his daughter's recovery, delegating responsibilities at the company so he could be present during every session with Faith. He observed that the connection between the two girls went far beyond simple friendship. They had shared experiences of trauma and loss that connected them on a deep level. Faith continued visiting regularly, but Arthur noticed the girl was facing her own difficulties. She often arrived showing signs of tiredness, and her tutor, Mrs. Hattie, had mentioned they were going through financial problems. During a private conversation with Mrs. Hattie, when she came to pick Faith up after a session, Arthur learned more details about the girl's situation. "Faith is a special child," said Mrs. Hattie, a woman of about 60 with greying hair and kind eyes. "She has a natural gift for helping other children, but sometimes I worry she's taking on responsibilities far too heavy for her age." "What do you mean?" "After her grandmother passed, Faith feels responsible for continuing the work of helping traumatized children in the neighborhood. She spends afternoons visiting families who are going through hard times, always trying to help in some way." Arthur was impressed by the generosity of a child who had lost so much. "And how is your financial situation?" Mrs. Hattie hesitated before answering. "It's not easy, Mr. Arthur. My pension is small, and raising a child requires resources we sometimes don't have. But I don't regret adopting Faith. She brought light into my life." "Can I help in some way?" Arthur offered immediately. "You already help by allowing her to come here and help your daughter. That's good for her, you know. It's as if she's honoring her grandmother's memory." That night, Arthur thought of ways to repay the help Faith was giving his family. He didn't want to offer money directly, knowing the girl had refused before, but he needed to find a way to support someone who had given so much to them. The solution came when he watched Grace drawing again. His daughter had developed a passion for art since she began her recovery, and her drawings had become increasingly elaborate and emotionally expressive. Arthur had an idea. He could organize an exhibition of Grace's and Faith's drawings, selling the works and directing the money to a trust that supported other children in similar situations. It would be a way to honor the work of both girls and create something positive from their experiences of overcoming. When he presented the idea to Faith and Grace, both were thrilled. Faith had inherited her grandmother's artistic talent and created beautiful drawings that depicted her experiences helping other children. Grace, in turn, had begun drawing visual representations of the sounds she was relearning to hear. The exhibition was organized in the local church's event hall with the help of Father Michael, who was well acquainted with the work Faith's grandmother had done in the community. The community's response was astonishing. People from all over town came to see the drawings and hear the story of the two girls. During the opening of the exhibition, something remarkable happened. Grace approached the microphone that had been set up for speeches and, with a voice still weak but clear, spoke publicly for the first time since her recovery. "I want to thank Faith for teaching me that it's safe to listen again. And I want to thank my dad for learning to speak from the heart." The audience fell silent for a few seconds before erupting into emotional applause. Arthur felt tears roll down his face as he hugged his daughter, proud not only of her recovery, but of her courage in sharing her story. The exhibition raised a significant amount, which was used to create the Dorothy Miller Trust in honor of Faith's grandmother. The trust would provide support for families with children facing emotional trauma, offering both financial resources and access to alternative therapies. Faith officially became the trust's first ambassador, using her experience and intuition to identify other children who could benefit from the program. Mrs. Hattie was hired as coordinator, ensuring she and Faith had financial stability while continuing their community work. Months later, Arthur reflected on how his life had completely changed since that day Faith had mysteriously appeared in his garden. Grace had regained not only her hearing, but also her joy for life. She attended a regular school and had become an outgoing and confident child. The relationship between father and daughter had been completely rebuilt. Arthur had learned to prioritize quality time with Grace, and the two had developed weekly traditions like drawing nights and walks in the park. He had also restructured his company to allow for better work-life balance. Faith remained a regular presence in their lives, but now, as part of an extended family that included Mrs. Hattie and several other children, the Dorothy Miller Trust had helped. The girl had grown in confidence and maturity, but kept her special ability to connect with traumatized children. During a Sunday afternoon, while watching Grace and Faith playing in the garden with other children from the program, Arthur thought about the concept of miracles. He had learned that sometimes miracles don't come from supernatural interventions, but from the human capacity to heal one another through love, patience, and understanding. The story of the two girls had spread beyond the limits of their town. Journalists and researchers began to take an interest in the unconventional methods Faith had used to help Grace. Universities expressed interest in studying the integrative approach that combined traditional medical aspects with emotional healing techniques. Dr. Thomas Barrett had become one of the leading advocates for research exploring the connection between emotional trauma and physical manifestations in children. He often cited Grace's case as an example of the importance of considering psychological factors in medical diagnoses. "What we learned from Grace," he explained during a medical conference, "is that sometimes children develop physical symptoms as a mechanism of emotional protection. Our work as doctors should include not only treating the symptoms, but understanding the underlying emotional causes." Faith's life had also transformed in unexpected ways. Her experience helping Grace had revealed a natural talent that several institutions wanted to study and support. A university offered a full scholarship for her to study child psychology when she reached the appropriate age, ensuring her skills would be formally developed. Mrs. Hattie had become a respected figure in the community, coordinating not only the Dorothy Miller Trust, but also a support network for families facing crises. Her home had become a reference point for parents who needed guidance on how to help traumatized children. Every day, Arthur marveled at how a single afternoon had completely changed the course of their lives. He had learned that sometimes the answers we seek don't come from where we expect, and that wisdom can manifest through the most unlikely people. Grace, now 11 years old, had developed not only complete hearing but also a special sensitivity for identifying other children who were going through emotional difficulties. She often brought home schoolmates who seemed sad or isolated, and together with Faith, she created a welcoming environment where these children felt safe to share their feelings. Arthur's house had transformed from a silent, formal mansion into a home full of life and laughter. Weekends were often occupied with trust activities, art therapy sessions, or simply moments of togetherness with the extended family that had formed around Faith and Mrs. Hattie. One day, during an especially moving session of the support group, a mother commented on how difficult it had been to find help for her son who had developed selective mutism after his parents' divorce. "No one knew how to help," she said, holding the hand of the boy who was now chatting animatedly with Faith. "The doctors only offered medication, but what he needed was someone who understood that he had chosen to stop speaking to protect himself." Faith smiled and placed a hand on the mother's shoulder. "Sometimes we just need someone to show us it's safe to use our voice again." Arthur observed the interaction and remembered his own words to Grace on that transformative day. "I promise you will never need to stop listening to protect yourself from me again." He had kept that promise, creating an environment where his daughter felt safe to be completely herself. The relationship between Arthur and Grace had deepened in ways he had never imagined possible. They had developed a communication that went far beyond words. Grace had become his advisor on matters related to the trust, offering insights into the needs of other children that often escaped adults. "Daddy," Grace said one evening, as they reviewed the cases of children the trust was supporting, "Lily needs more time with other kids who understand what she's been through. She's still afraid her parents will start fighting again." Arthur followed his daughter's suggestion and organized regular meetups where Lily could interact with other children who had overcome similar family traumas. The approach worked, and Lily gradually became more confident and communicative. Faith, now 12, had become a reference not just locally, but regionally. Families traveled from neighboring towns to seek her help with children facing various kinds of emotional trauma. She never charged for the sessions, maintaining her grandmother's philosophy, but the Dorothy Miller Trust ensured she and Mrs. Hattie had all the necessary resources. During an interview for a documentary about alternative methods of child healing, Faith was asked how she had developed her skills so young. "Grandma Dorothy always said that when you go through pain, you can choose to use that experience to help others or to become bitter," Faith replied with impressive maturity. "I chose to turn my pain into something that could help other kids not get stuck in sadness." The documentary, when finished, brought even more attention to the work being developed. Invitations began arriving for Faith and Arthur to share their story at conferences and seminars on children's mental health. Arthur initially hesitated to expose Grace to public attention, but his daughter showed genuine interest in helping to spread the message that traumatized children can recover when they receive the right kind of support. "I want other kids to know they don't have to stay trapped in silence," Grace said during one of her first public talks. "And I want parents to know that sometimes healing starts when we stop trying to fix our children and start trying to understand them." The audience was visibly moved by the girl's words. Her ability to articulate her experience of trauma and recovery so clearly and inspirationally impressed mental health professionals. Dr. Thomas Barrett, who was attending the talk, commented afterward, "Grace has not only fully recovered, but has developed a capacity to communicate about trauma that could benefit our professional training. She understands aspects of the childhood experience that we as adults sometimes overlook." The talks became more frequent, always with Arthur, Grace, and Faith working as a team. They developed a presentation that combined Arthur's medical perspective. He had become quite versed in literature on childhood trauma, Grace's personal experience, and Faith's practical methods. At each presentation, parents would approach with tears in their eyes, reporting they had finally found hope for their own children. Many remarked they had never considered that behaviors like deafness, mutism, or extreme isolation could be forms of emotional protection rather than purely medical conditions. The Dorothy Miller Trust expanded its activities to include training for parents and caregivers. Faith and Mrs. Hattie developed workshops where they taught basic techniques for empathetic communication and recognizing signs of emotional trauma in children. "It's not about becoming a therapist," Faith would explain during the workshops. "It's about learning to look beyond the behavior and try to understand what the child is really feeling." The workshops always included practical exercises where participants learned to use simple objects like stones, bells, and different textures to create sensory connections with children who had emotionally withdrawn. It was an adapted version of the techniques that Faith's grandmother had developed, simplified for use by people without specialized training. During one of the most memorable workshops, a grandmother brought her 6-year-old grandson who had stopped speaking after witnessing a traffic accident. The child had not uttered a word in over 6 months, despite all conventional treatments. Faith worked with the boy using the vibrational stones, creating rhythmic patterns that represented sounds of nature, rain, wind, birds singing. Gradually, she introduced vibrations that represented sounds of daily life, footsteps, doors closing, caring voices. "These are vibrations of safety," Faith explained to the boy. "They show us that the world still has many beautiful and safe sounds." After about an hour, the boy began trying to vocally reproduce the sounds he was feeling through the vibrations. First just murmurs, then more defined sounds, and finally words. "Grandma," he said, looking at the woman who had brought him, "I'm not scared of the noises anymore." The boy's transformation in a single session impressed all the workshop participants. His grandmother cried with emotion, explaining that she had begun to believe she would never hear her grandson's voice again. Arthur observed the scene and vividly remembered how he had felt the day Grace had said "Daddy" for the first time in years. The feeling of relief, gratitude, and renewed hope was something he now witnessed regularly in the work of the Trust. The success of the workshops led to invitations to establish similar programs in other cities. Faith, now 13, had become a confident young woman who balanced her regular studies with the work of supporting other children. She had decided she wanted to study psychology and medicine so she could formally combine her natural intuition with scientific knowledge. "I want to better understand why some children react to trauma in certain ways," she explained to Arthur during one of their regular conversations. "If I can learn about how the brain and emotions work, maybe I can help even more children." Arthur had become something of a mentor to Faith, supporting her academic goals and offering guidance on how to balance her calling to help others with her own needs for personal development. "You need to remember to be a child too," he often reminded her. "Your generosity is wonderful, but you deserve time to play, dream, and discover who you are beyond your gift for helping others." Faith would smile and nod, but Arthur sensed that for her there was no real separation between helping others and being herself. The healing work had become an integral part of her identity, inherited from her grandmother and strengthened by her own experiences of overcoming. Grace, now 12, had developed her own interests and talents. Beyond her passion for art, she had discovered a love for music. Her unique experience of having lost and regained her hearing gave her a special appreciation for musical sounds. "Every note is like a gift," she explained to Arthur while practicing piano. "When you can't hear for a while, you learn that not everyone values sounds the way they should." Arthur had signed up for piano lessons along with his daughter, and they often played simple duets on Sunday afternoons. It was one more of the traditions they had developed to strengthen their relationship and create positive memories. Music became another therapeutic element in the work of the Dorothy Miller Trust. Grace Sterling began using simple little melodies to help other children express themselves emotionally. She discovered that some children could communicate feelings through musical sounds that they couldn't express with words. The collaborative work of Faith Miller, Grace Sterling, and Arthur Sterling had created a holistic approach to childhood healing that was gaining attention not just in the United States, but internationally. Invitations arrived to present their methods at conferences in other countries, but they chose to keep their focus local, believing they could have a greater impact by deepening the work in their own community. "We don't need to change the whole world," Faith observed during a trust planning meeting. "If we can make a difference here, other people will learn and take these ideas to other places." Her wisdom and humility continued to impress everyone around her. Mrs. Hattie often commented that Faith had inherited not only her grandmother's techniques, but also her balanced perspective on how to create lasting change. A particularly remarkable aspect of the work developed was how it had transformed not only the traumatized children, but also their families. Parents who initially arrived desperate and frustrated often became active advocates for the empathetic parenting methods. Arthur had documented dozens of cases of families who had completely restructured their dynamics after participating in the Trust's programs. Couples who were considering separation due to the stress of dealing with traumatized children often discovered that the problem wasn't the child, but the lack of appropriate tools to understand and support their emotional needs. "What we've learned is that traumatized children need healed parents too," Arthur explained during his talks. "When I managed to recognize my own contribution to Grace's trauma, I could begin to be part of the solution instead of perpetuating the problem." This honesty about his own failings as a father had become one of the most powerful parts of his presentations. Many parents identified with his experience of having prioritized work over family, or of having assumed that love was enough to overcome all problems without needing to change specific behaviors. The relationship between Arthur and Grace continued to deepen as she grew up. They had developed the habit of long conversations during evening walks in the garden, where Grace shared her thoughts about the children they were helping, and Arthur offered perspectives based on his life experience. During one of these walks, Grace made an observation that surprised Arthur with its depth. "Daddy, I think my deafness was a gift in disguise." "How so, sweetie?" "If I hadn't stopped hearing, maybe we would never have discovered how important it really is to understand each other. And maybe we would never have met Faith and discovered our calling to help other children." Arthur stopped walking and looked at his daughter, impressed by her ability to find positive meaning in an experience that had been so painful. "You don't resent the suffering you went through?" "Sometimes I feel sad thinking about the years we lost without communicating properly," Grace answered thoughtfully. "But I also see that maybe we needed to go through that to become the people we are today." Grace's emotional maturity was often remarked upon by teachers, therapists, and other families who participated in the Trust's programs. She had developed a rare ability to help other children process trauma without minimizing their pain or offering simplistic solutions. Faith and Grace had become an inseparable duo in the therapeutic work. Their complementary experiences, Faith as the child who had learned to heal others, and Grace as the child who had been healed, created a complete perspective that resonated with both children and parents. During a particularly difficult session with a boy who had developed self-destructive behaviors after his parents' traumatic divorce, it was Grace who found the key to establishing a connection. "I know you're angry," she said to the boy, who had refused to speak to any of the adults present. "I was really angry too when my parents couldn't take care of our family properly. The boy looked up for the first time during the session. "But are your parents divorced?" "My mother left when I was little," Grace answered honestly. "And for a long time, I blamed my father. But I learned that sometimes adults make mistakes not because they don't love us, but because they're going through hard times too." "And how did you stop being angry?" "I talked to my dad about how I felt, and he apologized and changed the things that were hurting me. It doesn't always happen that way, but sometimes it's worth trying." The conversation marked the beginning of the boy's recovery, as he gradually began to express his feelings instead of acting them out through self-destructive behaviors. His parents, inspired by Grace's honesty, also began participating in family therapy to better handle the effects of the divorce on their children. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing, the Dorothy Miller Trust had become a regional reference for holistic childhood trauma treatment. Pediatricians, psychologists, and social workers often referred families to its programs, recognizing that the integrated approach offered results that isolated conventional methods couldn't achieve. Dr. Thomas Barrett had become one of the Trust's lead research associates, scientifically documenting the outcomes of the methods developed by faith and refined through collective experience. His studies were being published in renowned medical journals, academically legitimizing the work being done. What we're documenting here challenges several traditional assumptions about childhood trauma treatment, Dr. Barrett explained during a presentation at a pediatrics conference. We're finding that empathetic and intuitive methods, when applied by people who have also gone through similar experiences, can be more effective than standardized medical protocols. The research was revealing that children responded particularly positively when helped by other children who had overcome similar traumas. The concept of peer healing was becoming a legitimate field of study, with Faith and Grace being considered inadvertent pioneers of the approach. During an interview for a child psychology magazine, Faith was asked how she discovered she could help other children. "I think it was when I realized my pain could serve something greater," she replied. "Grandma Dorothy always said we can't avoid suffering, but we can choose what to do with our suffering." The interviewer was impressed by the philosophical depth of the answer from a 14-year-old. "And what did you choose to do with your suffering?" "I turned it into a bridge to help other people cross to the other side of pain." The interview was widely shared and cited, establishing Faith as a young but influential voice in discussions about childhood resilience and community healing. The work they had developed had created a multiplier effect in the community. Families that had been helped by the Trust often became volunteers, offering support to other families facing similar situations. An organic support network had formed, with Faith and Grace at its center, but involving dozens of adults and children. Arthur often reflected on how a single afternoon had triggered such a sweeping transformation. His personal life was completely different. He had restructured his company to allow for greater family involvement, developed a deep and authentic relationship with Grace, and found a purpose that went far beyond financial success. "Sometimes I think Faith was truly sent by some higher force," he remarked to Mrs. Hattie during a trust planning meeting. "Perhaps she was," Mrs. Hattie replied with a wise smile. "Or perhaps you were simply ready to receive what she had to offer. Grandma Dorothy always said miracles happen when open hearts meet souls willing to serve." Dorothy Miller's philosophy had become the foundation of the work being developed. Her techniques had been documented and systematized, but always maintaining the empathetic and intuitive essence that made them effective. The Trust had published a basic manual on empathetic communication techniques for traumatized children, distributed free of charge to professionals in the field. Faith had insisted that the manual include a section written by Grace, detailing the perspective of a child who had gone through the process of trauma and recovery. That section became one of the most valuable parts of the material, offering insights that only someone who had lived through the experience could provide. "It's important that people understand recovery doesn't mean forgetting what happened," Grace had written. "It means learning to carry the experience in a way that doesn't stop us from living fully." Her ability to articulate complex concepts about trauma and healing continued to impress professionals in the field. Several psychologists had commented that Grace's observations could be included in university textbooks on childhood resilience. As Faith approached high school, she began to consider her academic plans more seriously. Several universities had offered scholarships, recognizing her pioneering work in childhood healing. She had decided to study psychology with a specialization in trauma, but also wanted to include studies in medicine to better understand the connections between emotional and physical health. "I want to become the kind of professional I wish I had met when I was a child," she explained to Arthur during one of their conversations about the future. "Someone who understands both the science and the heart of healing." Arthur had offered to financially support her studies, but Faith had preferred to accept one of the scholarships offered, maintaining the independence she had learned from her grandmother. "Grandma Dorothy always said we should accept help when we need it, but we should also walk on our own 2 feet whenever possible," Faith explained. "I want to earn my place at university through my own effort." Her determination and integrity continued to inspire everyone around her. Mrs. Hattie often commented that Faith had inherited not only her grandmother's healing abilities, but also her solid values and balanced perspective on life. Grace was also making plans for the future. At 13, she had developed interests in music therapy and art therapy, wanting to combine her personal passions with the work of helping other children. "I want to continue the work we started," she told Arthur, "but I also want to find my own ways to contribute." Father and daughter had discussed the possibility of her studying abroad to expand her perspective on different therapeutic approaches, but always with the understanding that she would return to continue the work in Brazil. "Our community was where it all began," Arthur observed. "It's only right that it's here where we continue developing these methods." The Dorothy Miller Trust had received invitations to expand to other regions of the country, but the decision had been to maintain a local focus while offering training and consulting to groups who wanted to implement similar programs in their own communities. "The idea isn't to create a franchise," Faith explained, during a meeting with representatives from other cities. "It's to plant seeds that can grow naturally in each place, adapted to local needs." This philosophy of organic growth had resulted in programs inspired by the Trust's work being developed in over 20 Brazilian cities. Each program maintained the core principles: empathetic communication, involving children as healing agents and focusing on resolving underlying emotional trauma, but adapted specific methods to local cultural and social characteristics. Arthur had become a sort of informal consultant for these programs, sharing not only technical knowledge, but also his personal experience as a father who had learned to prioritize relationships over professional success. "The transformation has to start within ourselves," he often said during consultations. "We can't help traumatized children if we aren't willing to examine our own contributions to their trauma." This message resonated especially with parents and educators who participated in the trainings. Many commented that Arthur's honesty about his own failings encouraged them to be equally honest about the changes they needed to make. During a particularly impactful training session, one father remarked, "I spent 2 years trying to fix my depressed son without ever questioning if my work addiction was contributing to the problem. After I heard your story, I started working on my own healing first." The man reported significant improvements in his relationship with his son after he began prioritizing quality family time and seeking therapy to deal with his work compulsion. Cases like this became common in the programs inspired by the Dorothy Miller Trust. The family healing approach, rather than an exclusive focus on the troubled child, was demonstrating consistent results across different social and economic contexts. Dr. Thomas Barrett had compiled data from over 500 families who participated in the various programs, documenting improvement rates that significantly surpassed conventional, isolated methods. What we consistently see is that when we approach childhood trauma as a family and community phenomenon, rather than an individual problem of the child, we get much more lasting results, he explained during a presentation at an international conference. The research was attracting international academic attention, with American and European universities expressing interest in studying the developed methods. Faith had received invitations for exchange programs that would allow her to share her experience while learning about approaches used in other countries. "It would be interesting to see how other cultures handle childhood trauma," she commented to Arthur. "Perhaps we can learn things that help us improve our own work." Arthur supported the idea, recognizing that exposure to different perspectives could only enrich the work Faith was developing. Plans were made for her to participate in an exchange program during her senior year of high school, focused on observing child healing programs in 3 different countries. Grace was also interested in international experiences, but wanted to wait until completing her own studies in music and art therapy in Brazil. "I want to have a solid foundation in what we already know before trying to learn new things," she explained. "Faith can be our international ambassador for now." The relationship between the 2 girls had evolved from a friendship based on shared trauma to a genuine professional partnership. They had developed complementary methods that worked especially well when applied together. During a session with a 9-year-old girl who had developed severe anxiety after her parents' contentious divorce, Faith and Grace demonstrated how their methods integrated naturally. Faith began with vibrational techniques, helping the girl calm down and establish a receptive emotional state. Grace then introduced simple musical exercises that allowed the child to express feelings she couldn't verbalize. Together, they created an environment where the girl felt safe to share fears she had held for months. "I'm afraid it's my fault that they split up," the girl finally confessed. "They fought a lot about how much money to spend on me." Faith and Grace exchanged a look, immediately recognizing the unwarranted guilt many children carry in divorce situations. They worked together to help the girl understand that adult decisions are the responsibility of adults, not children. "Adults sometimes don't know how to handle difficult problems," Grace explained gently. "That doesn't mean you did anything wrong." Faith complemented this with exercises that helped the girl distinguish between age-appropriate responsibilities and responsibilities that belong to the adults in her life. The session was filmed, with the family's permission, for use in future training, demonstrating how 2 teenagers could facilitate therapeutic insights that often eluded experienced adult professionals. Dr. Thomas Barrett commented after watching the footage, "What we see here is genuine peer communication. These girls aren't trying to be therapists in the traditional sense. They're being wise older sisters who share similar experiences." This observation had become central to the philosophy of the Dorothy Miller Trust. The best results came not from trying to turn Faith and Grace into miniature professionals, but from allowing them to use their natural wisdom and lived experiences to create authentic connections with other children. As the years passed, the story of the 2 girls became almost legendary in the local community. Children who had been helped by the trust often returned as volunteers when they became teenagers, creating a continuous cycle of healing and service. Arthur observed with pride how Grace had become a natural leader among these older children, guiding them on how to use their own experiences of overcoming hardship to help younger children. She inherited not just the ability to heal herself, but the ability to teach others to heal themselves, he remarked to Faith during one of their regular conversations. "That's how Grandma Dorothy's work stays alive," Faith replied, "through each person who learns to transform their pain into healing for others." The legacy of Dorothy Miller had expanded far beyond what she had probably imagined when developing her techniques decades earlier. Her lessons about transforming suffering into service had become the foundation of a support network that touched hundreds of lives. During a special ceremony organized to mark the 5th anniversary of the Dorothy Miller Trust, Faith gave a speech that perfectly encapsulated the evolution of the work. Grandma Dorothy planted seeds of healing that continue to grow through every child who learns they are not alone in their pain. What began as techniques to help one deaf girl became a family of people committed to the idea that no one needs to carry trauma alone. The audience, composed of families who had been helped, professionals who had been trained, and children who had become volunteers, rose in a prolonged standing ovation. Arthur, watching from the front row with Grace by his side, felt a profound gratitude for everything that had happened since that transformative afternoon 5 years earlier. His life had gained a purpose that went far beyond business success, and his relationship with his daughter had become richer, and more authentic than he had ever dreamed possible. "Dad," Grace whispered during the applause, "do you think Mum would be proud of what we've become?" The question caught Arthur by surprise. Grace rarely mentioned her mother, and he had assumed she had fully processed that loss. "I'm sure she would be," he answered, hugging his daughter, "especially proud of how you've transformed your pain into something that helps so many other people." "Sometimes I still miss her," Grace admitted, "but it doesn't hurt like it used to. Now it's more like gratitude for having had a mother who loved me, even if it was for a short time." His daughter's emotional maturity continued to impress Arthur. Grace had learned to honor her mother's memory without letting the loss define her entire life. After the ceremony, during the celebratory dinner, several people approached to share how the Trust's work had impacted their lives. One mother told how her daughter had overcome selective mutism. A father reported how he had learned to communicate better with his autistic son, and a couple described how they had almost lost custody of their children before learning empathetic parenting techniques. "You didn't just help our children," said one of the mothers. "You saved our entire families." Faith, now 18 and about to begin her university studies, listened to these accounts with the humility that had characterized her work from the beginning. "What we did was show that the healing was already inside each family," she responded. "We just helped people find it." During her last year before university, Faith had focused on training other young people to continue the direct work with children. She had identified 3 teenagers from the community itself who demonstrated a natural aptitude for empathetic work and spent months mentoring them on techniques and philosophy. "The idea was never that I would be indispensable," she explained to Arthur. "The idea was always to plant seeds that could grow independently of me." Grace, now 16, had taken on a growing role in coordinating the programs, especially those involving music and art therapy. She had developed her own methods that complemented Faith's original techniques, creating an even more comprehensive approach. "We are constantly evolving," Grace observed during a planning meeting. "Every child we help teaches us something new about healing and resilience." Her leadership ability had become evident, and several team members commented that she demonstrated natural qualities for coordinating the Trust's future work. Dr. Thomas Barrett had completed a 10-year longitudinal study following children who had participated in the programs. The results were extraordinary. 93% of the children showed significant improvement in psychological well-being measures, and 87% maintained these improvements 5 years after participating in the programs. "These numbers are impressive for any psychological intervention," he explained during a presentation at a child mental health conference. "What makes the results even more remarkable is that they were achieved through methods developed by teenagers with no formal training, based on intuition and personal experience." The study had been published in one of the most respected international psychology journals, academically legitimizing the work that Faith had started when she was an 8-year-old child. As Faith prepared to leave the community to begin her university studies, a special ceremony was organized to mark the transition. Children who had been helped by her over the years created a multimedia presentation, telling their stories of healing and transformation. "Faith taught us that being different doesn't mean being defective," said Toby, a 12-year-old boy who had overcome severe anxiety. "She taught us that our difficult experiences can make us stronger and more capable of helping others." "She never tried to fix us," added Lily, now a confident teenager who had overcome fears related to her parents' divorce. "She helped us understand and accept ourselves." The children's testimonials were moving, demonstrating not only recovery from specific symptoms, but the development of self-esteem, empathy, and life purpose. Faith, visibly touched by the tributes, responded with the sincerity that had always characterized her work. "You taught me as much as I tried to teach you. Each of you showed me a different way to be brave, to overcome difficulties, to find joy even after pain." She looked at Arthur and Grace in the audience. "And I learned that sometimes the best thing we can do is simply be present for someone going through a hard time, not trying to solve everything, but showing them they're not alone." During the farewell ceremony, it was announced that the Dorothy Miller Trust had received sufficient donations to establish a permanent scholarship in Faith's name. which would support young people from the community interested in studying psychology, medicine, or fields related to child mental health. The work Faith started will continue through every person she inspired, declared Mrs. Hattie, now officially recognized as the executive director of the trust. And through every child who learns, they can transform their own pain into strength to help others. Arthur, invited to speak during the ceremony, reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun that day when a mysterious girl had appeared in his garden. Faith taught me that true leadership doesn't come from power or money, but from the ability to see pain in others and respond with compassion. She transformed not only my daughter's life, but my own understanding of what it means to be a father, to be a man, to be part of a community. He looked at Grace, who was smiling through tears of pride. And Grace taught me that sometimes the most painful experiences can become our greatest sources of wisdom and strength. She took her own experience of trauma and transformed it into a capacity to heal others. In the days following Faith's departure for university, Grace naturally assumed the role of lead facilitator for the direct work with children. At 16, she had developed a maturity and intuition that impressed far more experienced professionals. During her first solo session with a new child, a 7-year-old boy who had developed recurring nightmares after witnessing domestic violence, Grace demonstrated she had truly inherited Faith's gift for empathetic communication. "I used to have nightmares too," she told the boy, as they worked with simple musical instruments. "My head was trying to protect me by making up scary stories, but it was really just making me more afraid." "How did you make the nightmares stop?" the boy asked, showing interest for the first time since he had arrived. "I learned that when we talk about the things that scare us, they get smaller," Grace explained. "And I learned that my dad was working to make our house a truly safe place." The conversation marked the beginning of the boy's recovery, who gradually began to process the trauma in a healthy way with the support of Grace and the Trust's team. Arthur observed the session through the one-way glass, impressed by the naturalness with which his daughter had taken on the role Faith had filled for so many years. "She's ready," remarked Dr. Thomas Barrett, who was also observing. "Grace has developed not just the techniques, but the emotional wisdom needed for this work." During the following months, Grace coordinated programs for over 30 children, always with appropriate adult supervision, but demonstrating growing independence and competence. She had developed her own protocols for different types of trauma, adapting musical and artistic methods to the specific needs of each child. A particularly innovative aspect of her work was how she integrated entire families into the healing process. Grace had developed sessions where parents and children created music or art together, facilitating communication about difficult topics through creative expression. "Sometimes it's easier to talk about feelings when our hands are busy creating something," she explained to a couple struggling to communicate with their teenage daughter. "Art gives us a different language for things that are hard to say with words." The technique worked remarkably well, and the family reported significant improvements in communication after just 3 integrated sessions. Faith kept in regular contact through video calls, following the Trust's progress and offering guidance when requested. Her university studies were confirming many of the intuitions she had developed through practical experience, but were also presenting new perspectives she planned to integrate into the work when she returned. "I'm learning about neuroplasticity and how positive experiences can literally reshape traumatized brains," she reported during one of the calls. "This scientifically explains why our methods work so well." Her university professors were impressed with the practical experience Faith brought to theoretical classes. She was often invited to share case studies from her work, offering real-world perspectives that enriched academic discussions. One professor commented that Faith represented the ideal type of psychology student, someone who combined a genuine passion for helping others with solid practical experience and a desire for deep scientific understanding. During the summer break, Faith returned to work intensively with the Trust, implementing some of the new techniques she had learned. She and Grace collaborated on developing an expanded program that incorporated elements of cognitive behavioral therapy with their established empathetic methods. "We're building a bridge between formal science and intuitive wisdom," Faith observed during a planning meeting. The two approaches complement each other perfectly. The expanded program was tested with a group of 20 families over the summer, with results that exceeded the most optimistic expectations. The combination of evidence-based techniques with personalized empathetic methods produced faster and more lasting improvements than any of the approaches used in isolation. Dr. Thomas Barrett carefully documented the results, planning to publish a study that would demonstrate how intuitive and scientific methods could be effectively integrated in the treatment of childhood trauma. "You are pioneering a new form of applied psychology," he told Faith and Grace, "an approach that honors both scientific rigor and natural human wisdom." Academic recognition was growing, but Faith and Grace kept their focus on the practical work with families in their community. They had learned that real impact came from authentic relationships and long-term commitment, not from external recognition. On the last day of Faith's summer break, the two young women walked through the garden of the mansion where it had all begun years before. The space had been expanded to include areas dedicated to outdoor therapeutic sessions, but it maintained the tranquil atmosphere that had facilitated their first meeting. "Sometimes it seems impossible that all of this started here," Grace commented, pointing to the spot where they had first met. "Grandma Dorothy always said you never know which small acts of kindness will grow into big things," Faith replied. "She planted seeds through her work with me. I planted seeds by helping you, and now we're both planting seeds that will keep growing through other people." "And Dad learned to plant seeds too," Grace added with a smile. "He's so different from the person he was when Mom left." Arthur had truly transformed from a workaholic businessman into a present father and community leader. His company remained successful, but he had learned to delegate responsibilities and prioritize personal relationships. He often spoke at business conferences about how discovering purpose beyond profit had improved not only his personal life, but also the culture and productivity of his company. "When I started treating my employees as whole people, not just productive resources, the quality of work improved dramatically," he explained to other business people. "And when I started prioritizing my daughter, I found I had more energy and focus for every other aspect of life." His most popular talk was titled, "How an 8-Year-Old Taught Me True Leadership," where he told Faith's story and how her methods had transformed his understanding of human relationships. As Faith returned for her second year of college, Grace took on even greater responsibilities with the trust. At 17, she was officially certified as a complementary therapy facilitator, always working under the supervision of licensed professionals, but leading most of the hands-on sessions. Her reputation had spread to universities studying innovative methods of childhood healing. Several undergraduate psychology programs had invited Grace to speak about her experience both as a patient and as a healing facilitator. During a lecture at Columbia University, Grace was asked how she had gone from a traumatized child to a young therapist in such a short time. "I think my trauma experience gave me a visceral understanding of how children feel when they're lost in pain," she answered. "And my healing experience showed me that recovery is always possible when you find the right people to support you on the path." "But how did you develop the necessary technical skills?" asked a professor. "I learned by observing Faith, studying with Dr. Thomas Barrett, and most of all by listening carefully to every child I've tried to help," Grace explained. "Every child taught me something new about human resilience." The audience was impressed by her articulation and depth of insight. Several undergraduate students approached her afterward to ask about volunteering or internship opportunities with the Dorothy Miller Trust. "You've created something many people want to be part of," commented the professor who had organized the lecture. "This is evidence that you've discovered something fundamental about human nature and healing." The growing interest was creating opportunities to expand the work, but also challenges in maintaining the quality and authenticity that had characterized the programs from the beginning. During a strategic meeting, Mrs. Hattie raised important questions about sustainable growth. "We need to be careful not to grow so fast that we lose the soul of the work." Dorothy always emphasized that genuine relationships cannot be mass-produced. Arthur agreed, suggesting they expand through intensive training of small groups rather than trying to create large-scale branches. "Our strength has always been the personalized approach and long-term commitment," he observed. "We must keep that as our highest priority." Grace proposed an innovative solution. Create a residency program where promising young people would spend 2 years living in the community and learning the methods through total immersion in the Trust's philosophy and practice. This way we can train people who truly understand the essence of the work, not just the superficial techniques, she explained. The idea was unanimously accepted and plans began to be developed for the first residency program, which would start when Faith completed her university studies. During her winter break, Faith returned with renewed enthusiasm and new ideas based on research she had been following at the university. She had become particularly interested in how traditional methods of community healing in other cultures could inform and enrich the work they were doing. "I've discovered that indigenous cultures all over the world have developed methods similar to Grandma Dorothy's," she reported to Arthur and Grace. "It seems there is a universal wisdom about how communities can heal trauma through empathetic relationships." She had made contact with researchers studying traditional healing methods in African, Asian, and Native American cultures, discovering common principles that validated the intuitions her grandmother had developed. "This confirms we didn't invent something new," Faith explained. "We rediscovered ancient wisdom and adapted it to our modern reality." This expanded cultural perspective added even more depth to the Trust's work. Faith began to integrate elements from other healing traditions that naturally complemented the already established methods. One particularly powerful element she introduced was the concept of circular healing, where groups of families who had overcome similar traumas would meet regularly to support families still in the healing process. "The idea is that no one graduates and stops participating," Faith explained. "Families who have been healed become healers for other families, creating a continuous circle of support and shared wisdom." The first circular healing group was formed with 10 families who had participated in the Trust's programs over the last 3 years. The results were extraordinary, both for the families offering support and for those receiving it. One mother commented, "Helping other families going through what we went through made me realize how much we've grown and strengthened. And it made me value even more the progress we had made." The dynamic created multiple layers of benefit. Families in healing received support from people who truly understood their experiences. Healed families found ongoing purpose and reinforced their own improvements, and the community developed greater collective resilience. Dr. Thomas Barrett was fascinated by the innovation. "You've created a community mental health model that could revolutionize how we think about trauma treatment. Instead of the traditional medical model where patients receive treatment and then graduate, you've built a system where healing is an ongoing community process." The model began attracting international attention when Faith presented preliminary results at a community psychology conference in Europe. Researchers from several countries expressed interest in adapting the model for their own communities. "What impresses me most," commented a Dutch psychologist after Faith's presentation, "is how you managed to maintain focus on individual healing while strengthening the entire community. Most programs focus on one or the other." Faith attributed the success to the philosophy she had learned from her grandmother. "Grandma Dorothy always said that people don't exist in isolation. We are all connected, so true healing has to happen in relationships and community." During her final university year, Faith began writing her thesis on integrative community-based models of childhood healing. The work systematically documented the methods developed by the Dorothy Miller Trust and compared results with other national and international programs. The thesis was being supervised by one of the country's most respected researchers in childhood trauma, who had commented that Faith's work represented a significant contribution to the field. "She is building a bridge between rigorous academic research and authentic community practice," the advisor explained to colleagues. "It's exactly the kind of work our field needs to advance." While Faith was completing her studies, Grace was finishing high school and making decisions about her own college plans. Several institutions had offered scholarships, recognizing both her unique experience and her academic potential. She had decided to study music therapy with a specialization in child development, planning to return to expand the artistic aspects of the Trust's work. I want to deepen the scientific understanding of how music can facilitate emotional healing, she explained to Arthur. I sense there's much more potential than we've been able to explore so far. Father and daughter had discussed the possibility of her studying abroad to broaden her perspectives, but Grace preferred a university in the US that offered excellent music therapy programs. I want to keep my roots in American culture, she said. I think our work has uniquely American characteristics that I don't want to lose. During one of the last sessions Grace led before leaving for college, she worked with a family that included 3 siblings who had witnessed domestic violence. Using simple musical instruments, she helped the children create a family-safe symphony, where each child contributed sounds representing how they felt now that they lived in a protected environment. Our music doesn't have the scary parts it used to have, observed the middle sister, an 8-year-old girl. Now it only has the beautiful parts. The session demonstrated how music could serve both as a diagnostic tool, revealing how children processed their experiences, and as a healing method, allowing for the expression and reprocessing of emotions. Arthur observed the session with paternal pride, but also with professional admiration. Grace had developed into an intuitive and competent facilitator who honored the tradition established by Faith while contributing her own innovations. She has found her own voice in the work, he commented to Mrs. Hattie after the session. She's not just copying Faith's methods, but creating approaches that reflect her own talents and perspectives. Dorothy would be proud to see how her work has blossomed through different generations of children, Mrs. Hattie replied. Each has brought unique gifts that expanded what is possible. Grace's high school graduation ceremony was held in the mansion's garden, the very spot where she had met Faith 7 years earlier. Families who had been helped by the trust attended, along with professionals who had collaborated, and local authorities who recognized the work's community impact. During her speech as class valedictorian, Grace reflected on the extraordinary journey that had led a deaf and traumatized child to become a young community leader. I've learned that our most difficult experiences can become our greatest sources of strength when we find ways to use our suffering to lessen the suffering of others. Every child I've had the privilege of helping has taught me something about courage, resilience, and the human capacity for transformation. She looked toward Faith, who had returned specially for the ceremony, and toward Arthur, who watched her with tears of pride. And I've learned that family isn't just about blood, but about people who choose to commit to our growth and healing over time. The speech was met with enthusiastic applause, and several audience members remarked afterward that they had rarely heard such profound words from someone so young. In the days following the graduation, Faith and Grace worked intensively to finalize training protocols and materials that would allow the Trust's work to continue during their absences for university studies. They created detailed guides for each type of childhood trauma they had learned to treat, including case studies, specific techniques, and guidance for when to refer families for additional professional support. We want anyone with an empathetic heart and genuine dedication to be able to learn these methods, Faith explained during a presentation of the materials for volunteers. These aren't techniques that require special gifts. They are approaches anyone can develop through practice and commitment. The training materials were organized into progressive modules, starting with basic principles of empathetic communication and advancing to specific techniques for different types of trauma. A particularly innovative aspect of the materials was how they integrated perspectives from children who had been both recipients and facilitators of healing. Testimonials and insights from children and teenagers who had participated in the programs offered unique perspectives that conventional training materials did not include. Dr. Thomas Barrett commented that the materials represented a significant contribution to the literature on childhood trauma. You've documented not just techniques, but a philosophy and wisdom that are often lost when innovative programs try to expand. These materials preserve the soul of the work, along with the methodology. During a final meeting before the 2 young women left for different universities, Arthur reflected on how their lives had been extraordinarily intertwined. Sometimes I think you two were destined to meet, not just to heal each other, but to discover methods that could help hundreds of other children. Faith smiled with the modesty that had always characterized her work. I think we're all connected in ways we don't fully understand. Grandma Dorothy always said that when we open our hearts to serve others, the universe conspires to place us where we can make the greatest difference. And perhaps our pain has purpose when we transform it into compassion, Grace added. Not that suffering is good, but that we can choose what to do with it. The conversation perfectly captured the philosophy that had guided the Trust's work from the beginning. Trauma is inevitable in human life, but isolation in trauma is optional when committed communities offer empathetic and consistent support. In the months that followed, as Faith and Grace settled into their respective universities, the Dorothy Miller Trust continued operating under the coordination of Mrs. Hattie and a team of trained volunteers. Arthur took on a more active role in daily supervision, discovering that direct work with families was even more rewarding than he had imagined. During a session with a family where their teenage son had developed depression after school bullying, Arthur applied principles he had learned from observing Faith and Grace. Sometimes, when we're hurt repeatedly, our mind decides it's safer not to try to connect with anyone, he explained to the boy. But isolation often increases the pain rather than lessening it. How do you know? The teenager asked, showing the first genuine interest in weeks. Because I also isolated myself when I was going through difficult times, Arthur answered honestly. I thought constantly working and avoiding painful feelings would protect me, but it really only made me lonelier and more disconnected from the people I loved. The conversation marked the beginning of a therapeutic relationship that would result in significant improvement for the young man. Arthur discovered that his own experience of trauma and healing uniquely qualified him to connect with families facing crises. You have a natural gift for this, Mrs. Hattie observed after the session. Faith and Grace didn't just receive healing through you, they taught you how to offer healing to others. During weekend visits, Faith and Grace returned to participate in special sessions and consultations, but mainly to maintain connection with the community that had become their extended family. Faith constantly brought new ideas based on university research, while Grace experimented with innovative musical techniques she was learning in her studies. Their contributions continued to evolve the work, even while they were physically absent most of the time. During one such visit, they worked with a particularly challenging situation. An immigrant family where the children were struggling to adapt culturally while processing the trauma of having left their home country due to dangerous conditions. Faith used techniques she had learned about cultural trauma, while Grace incorporated music from different cultures to help the children honor their heritage while embracing their new home. You don't have to choose between who you were and who you are becoming, Grace explained to the children. You can be both, creating something new that honors all parts of you. The culturally sensitive approach worked remarkably well, and the family reported significant improvement in adaptation and emotional well-being. The case demonstrated how the Trust's work continued evolving to meet the community's emerging needs. As Faith neared the completion of her university studies, she began making detailed plans to return and expand the Trust's work. Her thesis had received exceptional recognition, and several universities had offered postgraduate positions, but she was committed to returning to her home community. My heart has always been here, she explained to her professors, who tried to persuade her to stay in academia. I can contribute more to the field through practical work and applied research than through a traditional academic career. Grace was also planning to return after completing her undergraduate degree, bringing formal knowledge in music therapy that would perfectly complement the established methods. During a video call where the two discussed future plans, they reflected on how their partnership had evolved over the years. We started as two traumatized children helping each other, Faith observed. Now we are young professionals who have chosen to dedicate our lives to replicating that kind of healing for others. And we've learned that true healing is never just individual, Grace added. It always happens in relationships and community. Their plans for the future included expanding the residency model, establishing partnerships with universities for ongoing research, and systematically documenting all methods to facilitate replication in other communities. We want what Grandma Dorothy started to keep growing for generations, Faith said. Not through corporate expansion, but through people who capture the spirit of the work and adapt it to the needs of their own communities. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this transformative story about faith and grace. Do you believe small acts of kindness can really create such profound change? Leave your comments, sharing your own experiences of overcoming challenges or moments when someone special made a difference in your lives. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories of hope and healing.